In the labyrinthine corridors of human psychology, where vulnerability masquerades as strength and compassion often becomes a weapon wielded against the compassionate, there exists a philosophy so profound and yet so terrifying that few dare to fully comprehend its implications. It is the art of becoming untouchable, not through physical distance or emotional detachment, but through the systematic destruction of one's own weaknesses before others can exploit them. Marcus Aurelius once wrote that we suffer more in imagination than in reality, but what he failed to articulate was the deeper truth, that our suffering comes not from external forces, but from the internal weaknesses we refuse to acknowledge and eliminate. The untouchable individual understands this fundamental principle and acts upon it with surgical precision, transforming themselves into something beyond the reach of conventional manipulation, emotional warfare, and psychological domination. The concept of being untouchable transcends mere emotional resilience or stoic indifference. It represents a complete metamorphosis of the human psyche, where traditional vulnerabilities are not merely hidden or suppressed, but systematically identified, analyzed, and eliminated through deliberate psychological reconstruction. This is not the path of the enlightened sage seeking inner peace, nor the journey of the broken soul seeking healing. This is the calculated evolution of someone who has recognized that in a world where weakness is currency for manipulation, only those who have eliminated their own weaknesses can truly claim autonomy over their existence. The weak self, that collection of fears, insecurities, emotional dependencies, and psychological soft spots that every human carries, serves as a roadmap for those who would seek to control, manipulate, or destroy us. Every unresolved trauma becomes a button to be pushed, every insecurity a lever to be pulled, every emotional dependency a chain to be yanked. The individual who seeks to become untouchable must first conduct a merciless inventory of these vulnerabilities, not to heal them in the conventional sense, but to surgically remove them from their psychological architecture. Consider the man who fears rejection above all else. His entire behavioral matrix revolves around avoiding this fundamental terror, making him predictable, controllable, and ultimately weak. He will compromise his values, sacrifice his goals, and betray his own interests to maintain the illusion of acceptance. The untouchable individual recognizes this pattern not just in others, but, most crucially, in himself. He does not seek therapy to work through his fear of rejection. Instead, he systematically exposes himself to rejection until the fear loses all power over him. He does not overcome the fear, he destroys the part of himself that was capable of experiencing it. This process of self-destruction and reconstruction operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the emotional level, it requires the elimination of dependencies on external validation, the eradication of the need for approval, and the complete severance of any psychological umbilical cords that tie one's sense of self to the opinions, actions, or presence of others. On the intellectual level, it demands the destruction of cognitive biases, wishful thinking, and the comfortable delusions that most people use to navigate their daily existence. On the behavioral level, it necessitates the elimination of patterns, habits, and reactions that make one predictable and, therefore, manipulable. The first phase of this transformation begins with what can only be described as psychological archaeology, the methodical excavation of one's own psyche to identify every weakness, every fear, every emotional dependency that could potentially be weaponized against oneself. This is not a process for the faint-hearted, as it requires an individual to confront not only their conscious fears and insecurities, but also the deeply buried psychological programming that operates below the level of awareness. Most people go through life carrying a complex web of emotional dependencies that they mistake for virtues. The man who cannot function without his mother's approval calls it respect for family. The woman who sacrifices her ambitions for her partner's comfort calls it love. The employee who accepts abuse from his superior calls it professionalism. These are not virtues, they are vulnerabilities disguised as moral choices, and they represent points of leverage that others can use to control behavior, thoughts, and, ultimately, destiny. The process of identifying these dependencies requires a level of self-honesty that borders on the pathological. It means acknowledging that what we call love might be emotional dependence, that what we call loyalty might be fear of abandonment, that what we call principles might be nothing more than deeply ingrained patterns of behavior designed to avoid confronting our fundamental fears. This acknowledgement is not meant to induce guilt or self-hatred, but rather to provide the raw material for reconstruction. Once these vulnerabilities have been identified, the next phase involves their systematic elimination through controlled exposure and deliberate conditioning. This is where the process takes on its most Machiavellian characteristics, as it requires the individual to treat themselves as both the experimenter and the subject in a series of psychological experiments designed to break down existing response patterns and rebuild them according to a new design. Take, for example, the individual who has identified a deep-seated fear of financial insecurity. Rather than seeking to manage this fear through budgeting, insurance, or other conventional means, the untouchable individual might deliberately put themselves in situations of controlled financial stress to test and strengthen their psychological response. They might quit a stable job without having another lined up, not out of recklessness, but as a calculated exercise in destroying the part of themselves that requires financial security to feel safe. Through repeated exposure to the very thing they fear, they condition themselves to operate effectively regardless of their financial circumstances. This approach extends to every area of potential vulnerability. The individual who fears social rejection might deliberately engage in behavior that invites criticism or ostracism, not to be rebellious, but to prove to themselves that their survival and effectiveness do not depend on social acceptance. The person who has identified an unhealthy emotional attachment to a specific relationship might deliberately distance themselves from that person, not to punish them, but to ensure that their emotional equilibrium does not depend on external factors beyond their control. The key distinction here is that this process is not about becoming emotionally numb or socially disconnected. Rather, it is about ensuring that one's core functionality, decision-making capacity, and strategic effectiveness remain intact regardless of external circumstances. The untouchable individual does not avoid relationships, financial challenges, or social situations. They simply ensure that their response to these situations is based on strategic choice rather than emotional compulsion. This reconstruction process inevitably leads to a fundamental shift in how one perceives and interacts with other people. When you have eliminated your own vulnerabilities, you begin to see the psychological architecture of others with startling clarity. Every conversation becomes a masterclass in human psychology, as you observe the fears, insecurities, and dependencies that drive other people's behavior. This is not about becoming predatory or manipulative, but rather about developing an immunity to the manipulation attempts of others. The untouchable individual recognizes that most human interactions operate on the basis of unspoken psychological contracts. People offer approval in exchange for compliance, threaten rejection to induce desired behavior, and use emotional manipulation as a form of social currency. When you have eliminated your own need for approval and your fear of rejection, these contracts become null and void. You can observe them, understand them, and even participate in them when strategically advantageous, but you are no longer bound by them. This shift in perspective fundamentally alters the power dynamics in every relationship, whether personal, professional, or casual. When others cannot predict your responses because you have eliminated the emotional triggers that typically drive human behavior, they lose their ability to control or manipulate you. When they cannot threaten you with the loss of things you have already proven to yourself you can live without, their threats become meaningless. When they cannot offer you rewards that appeal to dependencies you have eliminated, their incentives lose their power. The second major phase of becoming untouchable involves the development of what might be called strategic empathy, the ability to understand and respond to the emotional needs of others without becoming emotionally invested in the outcome. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of the untouchable psychology, as it allows for the maintenance of functional relationships while preserving complete autonomy. Strategic empathy differs fundamentally from conventional empathy in that it is consciously deployed rather than automatically triggered. The untouchable individual can recognize when someone is seeking validation, comfort, or support, and can choose to provide these things when it serves their strategic interests, but they do not feel compelled to do so by emotional resonance or guilt. They understand that most people's emotional needs are essentially manipulation attempts, either conscious or unconscious, designed to create obligation and dependence. This does not mean that the untouchable individual becomes cruel or callous. Rather, they become selective about when and how they engage emotionally with others. They can provide genuine care and support when they choose to do so, but this choice is based on strategic considerations rather than emotional compulsion. They help others because they decide it aligns with their goals or values, not because they feel obligated by guilt, social pressure, or emotional manipulation. This selective emotional engagement serves multiple purposes. First, it preserves emotional energy for situations where it can be most effectively deployed. Second, it prevents others from developing expectations or dependencies that could later be used as leverage. Third, it maintains the mystery and unpredictability that are essential to remaining untouchable. When people cannot predict your emotional responses, they cannot develop strategies to manipulate those responses. The development of strategic empathy also involves learning to recognize and neutralize the emotional manipulation techniques that others employ, often unconsciously, in their daily interactions. These techniques include guilt-tripping, emotional blackmail, passive aggression, gaslighting, love bombing, and various forms of psychological pressure designed to create compliance through emotional discomfort. The untouchable individual learns to recognize these techniques not through theoretical study, but through direct experience and observation. They watch how people attempt to manipulate them and others, they study the emotional responses these techniques are designed to trigger, and they develop countermeasures that neutralize their effectiveness. More importantly, they learn to see through the social conditioning that teaches people to view these manipulation techniques as normal or even virtuous aspects of human interaction. Consider the common manipulation technique of emotional guilt. Someone might say, "If you really cared about me, you would do this," or "I can't believe you would let me down like this," or "After everything I've done for you, this is how you repay me?" These statements are designed to trigger guilt and compliance by linking the target's self-worth to their willingness to meet the manipulator's demands. The untouchable individual recognizes this pattern immediately and responds based on the actual merits of the request rather than the emotional pressure being applied. Their response might be something like, "I understand that you're disappointed, but my decision is based on what I believe is best overall, not on managing your emotions." This response acknowledges the other person's feelings without accepting responsibility for managing them, and it makes clear that emotional pressure will not influence the decision-making process. Over time, people learn that emotional manipulation simply does not work on this individual, which eliminates most attempts at psychological control. The third and most advanced phase of becoming untouchable involves the development of what can be called psychological invisibility, the ability to move through social and professional environments without revealing the true nature of one's psychological architecture. This is crucial because the untouchable individual's greatest vulnerability would be other people understanding the extent of their psychological independence and attempting to counter it through more sophisticated means. Psychological invisibility requires the maintenance of a carefully crafted external persona that appears to have the normal range of human vulnerabilities while concealing the true extent of one's psychological reconstruction. This is not about being deceptive or manipulative, but rather about maintaining strategic ambiguity regarding one's true capabilities and psychological state. The untouchable individual learns to display appropriate emotional responses in social situations, not because they feel these emotions, but because displaying them serves social and strategic functions. They may express gratitude for compliments without actually needing validation, show concern for others' problems without becoming emotionally invested in the outcomes, or demonstrate loyalty to organizations or relationships without developing genuine dependence on them. This external persona serves multiple functions. It allows the individual to maintain normal social and professional relationships without triggering the suspicion or hostility that often accompanies obvious psychological independence. It provides a form of camouflage that prevents others from recognizing the futility of attempting emotional manipulation. Most importantly, it creates the illusion of normalcy that allows the untouchable individual to observe and understand others without becoming the object of their analytical attention. The maintenance of psychological invisibility requires constant calibration and adjustment. The individual must understand the social expectations and emotional norms of their environment well enough to approximate them convincingly, while never allowing these performances to become genuine vulnerabilities. They must be able to turn on charm, concern, enthusiasm, or any other emotion when socially required, but they must also be able to turn these emotions off completely when they are no longer strategically useful. This aspect of the untouchable psychology perhaps most clearly illustrates its Machiavellian nature. The individual becomes capable of engaging in social and emotional interactions with complete cynicism, treating these interactions as performances designed to achieve specific outcomes rather than as genuine expressions of feeling or connection. This does not necessarily make them cruel or harmful, but it does make them fundamentally different from the emotionally driven individuals around them. The practical applications of these psychological skills extend into every area of life. In professional settings, the untouchable individual cannot be controlled through threats of termination, promises of advancement, or appeals to company loyalty. They perform their duties based on contractual obligations and strategic considerations, not out of emotional attachment to their role or organization. This makes them valuable employees in many ways, as they are not subject to the emotional drama and political manipulation that often compromise workplace effectiveness. In personal relationships, the untouchable individual can provide genuine companionship and support without becoming emotionally dependent or allowing others to become dependent on them. They can love without neediness, commit without desperation, and remain loyal without becoming enslaved. This makes them appealing partners in many ways, though their emotional independence can be threatening to individuals who prefer relationships based on mutual dependence and emotional manipulation. In social situations, the untouchable individual can navigate complex political dynamics without becoming trapped by allegiances, obligations, or social debts. They can participate in social hierarchies without being controlled by them, maintain friendships without being exploited by them, and engage in social institutions without being defined by them. Perhaps most importantly, the untouchable individual develops a relationship with power that is fundamentally different from that of ordinary people. Most individuals either fear power or crave it, both of which represent forms of psychological dependency that can be exploited. The untouchable individual views power simply as a tool useful in certain circumstances, irrelevant in others, and never worth sacrificing core autonomy to obtain or maintain. This perspective on power extends to all forms of external control or influence. Wealth becomes a useful resource rather than a source of security or status. Social position becomes a strategic advantage rather than a reflection of personal worth. Relationships become sources of mutual benefit rather than emotional lifelines. Knowledge becomes a practical tool rather than a source of intellectual pride. The ultimate goal of this psychological reconstruction is not to become a sociopath or to eliminate all human feeling, but rather to ensure that one's core functionality, decision-making ability, and strategic effectiveness are not dependent on external factors that could be manipulated, threatened, or removed by others. The untouchable individual may still experience emotions, form attachments, and care deeply about various causes or people, but these feelings do not compromise their fundamental autonomy or create vulnerabilities that others can exploit. This state of psychological independence inevitably leads to a profound shift in one's relationship with fear, uncertainty, and loss. The untouchable individual does not become fearless, but rather develops a relationship with fear where it provides information rather than motivation. They may recognize that a situation is dangerous without being paralyzed by anxiety about potential negative outcomes. They may acknowledge that a relationship is important to them without being terrified of losing it. They may value their possessions, position, or reputation without being controlled by threats to these things. This transformation of the relationship with fear is perhaps the most liberating aspect of becoming untouchable. Fear is the primary tool that others use to control behavior, whether through threats of physical harm, social ostracism, economic damage, or emotional pain. When fear becomes merely informational rather than motivational, these threats lose their power to compel specific behaviors or decisions. The untouchable individual might receive a threat to their employment and think, "This person is attempting to control my behavior through fear of economic insecurity. Let me evaluate whether compliance serves my strategic interests or whether the threat itself reveals information that changes my assessment of this situation." Rather than being immediately motivated by fear to comply with demands, they use the threat as data to inform their strategic response. This analytical approach to threats and pressure extends to all forms of attempted psychological control. Emotional blackmail is recognized as an attempt to create guilt-based compliance. Social pressure is seen as an effort to leverage the human need for acceptance. Gaslighting is identified as a technique for creating doubt and dependence. Once these techniques are recognized as tools rather than legitimate forms of communication or relationship, they lose their power to influence behavior. The practical implications of achieving this level of psychological independence are both liberating and isolating. The untouchable individual gains tremendous freedom to make decisions based on their own analysis and values rather than on external pressure or emotional compulsion. They can pursue goals that others might consider risky, unconventional, or unrealistic because they are not constrained by the need for approval or the fear of criticism. They can end relationships, change careers, relocate, or make other major life changes based solely on their assessment of what serves their interests and values. However, this freedom comes at the cost of the emotional securities and social connections that most people rely on for comfort and meaning. The untouchable individual cannot depend on others for emotional support in the conventional sense, as this would recreate the very vulnerabilities they have worked to eliminate. They cannot seek validation, comfort, or reassurance from external sources without risking the psychological independence they have achieved. This isolation is not necessarily painful, as the process of becoming untouchable typically eliminates the emotional needs that would make such isolation distressing. However, it does create a fundamental barrier between the untouchable individual and the emotionally dependent people who make up the majority of human society. Relationships become strategic alliances rather than emotional bonds. Social interactions become performances rather than genuine expressions. Professional environments become chess games rather than collaborative endeavors. The untouchable individual learns to navigate this isolation by developing internal sources of meaning, satisfaction, and entertainment. They may derive fulfillment from the mastery of skills, the achievement of goals, the accumulation of knowledge, or the successful execution of complex strategies. They may find satisfaction in observing and understanding human behavior, in testing their own psychological limits, or in the simple appreciation of their own autonomy and effectiveness. This internal focus does not necessarily make them selfish or antisocial, but it does make their relationship with others fundamentally different from conventional human relationships. They may care deeply about certain people or causes, but this caring does not create emotional dependency or psychological vulnerability. They may work diligently for the benefit of others, but this work is motivated by chosen values rather than emotional compulsion or social pressure. The philosophical implications of the untouchable psychology extend far beyond individual transformation. If significant numbers of people achieve this level of psychological independence, it would fundamentally alter the nature of human society. Political systems based on emotional manipulation would lose their effectiveness. Economic structures built on manufactured insecurity would collapse. Social hierarchies maintained through artificial scarcity of approval and acceptance would become irrelevant. The untouchable individual exists as a kind of evolutionary pressure on existing social, political, and economic systems. Their immunity to conventional forms of control forces these systems to either adapt or lose relevance. Organizations that rely on employee insecurity to maintain control find that untouchable individuals cannot be managed through traditional methods. Political movements that depend on emotional manipulation discover that their techniques fail to influence psychologically independent voters. Social institutions built on exclusivity and status lose their power when interacting with individuals who do not seek their validation. This resistance to conventional control mechanisms is not necessarily revolutionary in the traditional sense, as the untouchable individual is not typically motivated by a desire to overthrow existing systems. Rather, their psychological independence creates a form of passive resistance that forces systems to evolve or become irrelevant. They participate in society on their own terms rather than on the terms dictated by social, political, or economic pressures. The development of this psychology requires not only the elimination of vulnerabilities but also the cultivation of certain positive capabilities that support psychological independence. These include the development of multiple income sources to reduce economic dependency, the cultivation of diverse skills to maintain adaptability, the creation of multiple social and professional networks to avoid over-reliance on any single group, and the maintenance of physical and mental health to preserve autonomy and effectiveness. The untouchable individual becomes, in essence, anti-fragile, not merely resistant to shock and stress, but actually strengthened by adversity. Challenges become opportunities to test and refine their psychological independence. Failures become data points for improving their strategies. Attacks become chances to identify and eliminate any remaining vulnerabilities. Rather than being damaged by negative experiences, they use these experiences as raw material for continued development and refinement. This anti-fragile quality extends to all areas of life. Professional setbacks become opportunities to develop new skills or explore different career paths. Relationship endings become chances to refine their understanding of human psychology and their own needs and values. Financial losses become lessons in resource management and motivation for developing additional income sources. Health problems become catalysts for optimizing physical and mental performance. The untouchable psychology represents a fundamental departure from conventional approaches to personal development, which typically focus on healing trauma, building self-esteem, or developing better relationships with others. Instead, it focuses on eliminating dependencies, neutralizing vulnerabilities, and developing complete autonomy over one's psychological state and behavioral responses. This approach is not suitable for everyone, nor is it necessarily desirable from a conventional standpoint. It requires a level of self-discipline, emotional detachment, and analytical thinking that many people would find impossible or unpleasant. It also results in a way of being in the world that can be isolating and may conflict with traditional values regarding community, family, and emotional connection. However, for individuals who find themselves repeatedly victimized by manipulation, control, or exploitation, the untouchable psychology offers a radical alternative to conventional approaches to protection and empowerment. Rather than trying to find better people to trust or better environments to inhabit, it focuses on making oneself immune to the techniques that predatory individuals use regardless of where they are encountered. The process of becoming untouchable is ultimately about reclaiming complete sovereignty over one's own mind, emotions, and behavior. It is about ensuring that one's responses to life circumstances are based on conscious choice rather than unconscious programming, strategic analysis rather than emotional reactivity, and personal values rather than external pressure. In a world where psychological manipulation has become increasingly sophisticated and pervasive, this sovereignty may represent the highest form of personal freedom available. The journey towards psychological invulnerability is neither quick nor easy, and it requires a fundamental willingness to sacrifice the comforting illusions and emotional securities that most people depend on for stability and meaning. It demands a level of self-honesty that can be psychologically brutal and a commitment to self-transformation that must be maintained over years or even decades. Yet for those who complete this journey, the rewards are profound. They achieve a form of freedom that is barely comprehensible to ordinary consciousness, freedom from fear, from neediness, from the opinion of others, from emotional manipulation, from social pressure, and from all the countless forms of psychological control that most people experience as unavoidable aspects of human existence. The untouchable individual stands as a testament to the possibility of complete psychological autonomy, demonstrating that it is possible to live in the world without being controlled by it, to engage with others without being manipulated by them, and to care deeply about various people and causes without becoming vulnerable through that caring. They represent a form of human development that transcends conventional notions of emotional health, social adaptation, and personal fulfillment. In the end, the art of being untouchable is not about becoming cold, cruel, or disconnected from humanity. It is about achieving such complete mastery over one's own psychology that external attempts at control become not just ineffective, but irrelevant. It is about developing the ability to choose one's responses to all life circumstances based on wisdom, strategy, and personal values rather than fear, neediness, or social pressure. The man who destroys his weak self has indeed made himself invulnerable to destruction by others, not because he has become hardened or callous, but because he has eliminated the psychological leverage points that others could use to control, manipulate, or harm him. He has achieved the ultimate form of personal sovereignty, complete autonomy over his own mind and behavior, regardless of external circumstances or pressures. This sovereignty is perhaps the highest achievement possible for human consciousness, not enlightenment in the traditional spiritual sense, but something far more practical and immediately useful. Complete freedom from psychological control by others, achieved through the systematic elimination of one's own psychological vulnerabilities and dependencies. It is a freedom that must be earned through discipline, sacrifice, and relentless self-examination, but, once achieved, it provides a form of invulnerability that no external force can compromise or destroy.